So let's get started. What is the cloud? Other than the fluffy thing in the sky, which rains a lot, it is a technology solution. So the cloud has been around for many, many years. Originally, we had mainframes. So this was a form of cloud computing. It wasn't in your office, it was in someone else's. And they used to offer bureau services. Now, these were back in the 60s and 70s, and you could rent part of this bureau for your own use. And this was the first sort of implementation of cloud computing. Nowadays, it doesn't look much different. Okay, it's got a few more shiny lights and the technology goes a lot better, but actually the concepts are still the same. They do bring with them different privacy risks now to how it used to be, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. So in terms of what is different, the key difference when we use cloud is the kind of operating model you use and how you use that cloud service. It isn't all about technology. A lot of it is around people and process, and even outsourcing partners form part of the risk profile. So first of all, why don't we talk through what are the different kinds of clouds and the operating models, so we have some context for privacy in the cloud. And then we can discuss what the challenges are with the different kinds of privacy. So, not all the clouds are the same. It is really common for the IT department to refer to something being in the cloud. But actually, there is not one giant cloud sitting out there somewhere in IT land with everything in it. There are multiple clouds and multiple cloud types. So, first of all, the one we hear less of is a private cloud. So this is a cloud that your organization owns and it runs just for you. Now, there are certain entities who do run a private cloud for their reasons. These are usually more large multinationals who may have a private cloud solution for them. But even then, it doesn't always mean private. It is on their own infrastructure, so their own servers, their own rack in the server room, but there is still usually an outsourced provider involved. In terms of that cloud can be located in the customer's own data center, or it could be located at somewhere like Microsoft or AWS. And you can manage your cloud, or you could get someone else to manage it for you. So the key difference for the private cloud is you've got some guarantee that the only person in that cloud is you and your stuff, and it is all in your direct control, either through you or through your vendor, as to what is going on. The more common one, though, is a public cloud. So these are servers like the Microsofts, the AWS, the government shared cloud services that are there, and they are available to multiple people at the same time. So a common terminology we have here is tenants. So if you think of that public cloud as an apartment block, within that apartment block, we have individual apartments where we have a tenant in them. So when you subscribe to Microsoft or AWS, you usually purchase a tenancy. So this is kind of your apartment, and you have the control over it. And we will talk more about the different kinds of operating models in a minute, because that can actually have implications on that. Generally, the public clouds are owned by the vendor. So the vendor in this mix will then sell those public clouds to whoever wants to buy them. So you have no say on who else is sharing the infrastructure with you, whether you like them or not. Whether you want your data to be alongside them or not is not a call you have. So literally you sign up and that is what you have. Other types of clouds we have sometimes is a hybrid cloud. So this is where a little bit of the cloud is a private cloud and a little bit is a public cloud. The main reason people use that is that they might want to keep some of their stuff very secure, and then they're more happy to have some of it on a more open and public cloud. There is also then the concept of a community cloud. So it's where infrastructure is shared between several organizations who then have a shared understanding. So that might be a community cloud for accountants, or a community cloud for banking, for example. Or in the government space, we have a community cloud for some of our cloud services, where only government can use that infrastructure and can become a tenant in it. So it's kind of like a retirement village. There are rules about who can go into that tenancy, and you have to meet the criteria before you're allowed in that community cloud. But all of these clouds are very similar in terms of the risks and what comes with them. We then have various operating models. So these are the common terminology that you will hear the IT guys throw out when they tell you about their software. So if we start first of all, IaaS, so it stands for Infrastructure as a Service. In effect, it means that you buy a piece of tin with the lights on, and we'll cover off a bit more about what's included shortly. We then have Platform as a Service. So it's got an operating system on, and you can build things on it. It often also has set applications on it. So you might buy Platform as a Service for SQL Server, for example. And then we have the far end of the scale, Software as a Service. So this is where you buy into a product that someone is making on the cloud. So really common ones we use in New Zealand: Xero for our accounting, Office 365. Those are examples. You get them, you buy them like you would used to buy a CD, and the software comes as the software is. So in terms of that, what we have is a sliding scale of what you're responsible for. So when we start out and it's on premise, so when the server is used to be in the olden days in your server room, you are responsible for absolutely everything on it. And as you can see, as we slide up to the right of the side of the scale where we have software as a service, you as an organization become responsible for very little. Now, in terms of that though, that also means you have less control and potentially less visibility about what is going on in that. So it does shift the risk profile for you as an agency as you shift further to the right for it. And for that reason, some people will not move to the cloud, or will only move to the cloud for infrastructure as a service, where they have everything except for the server with the flashing lights on in their direct control. But it is a risk profile decision to be made. So why do we move to the cloud? First of all, why do people actually want to do this? So the main reason people shift to the cloud is about savings usually. It is not cost sensible anymore in New Zealand to run your own data center unless you are Datacom or a large multinational. Most of us do not have the infrastructure or want to have the infrastructure or expertise in-house to do this. But also, they allow you to be more efficient and more cost effective. So one of the key things for the cloud is that you can start and stop servers instantly. So for example, when we decide that we are going to have everyone working remotely from home, and we need a further 4 remote access servers, for example, we can press a button and they appear. No waiting for that hardware, no need to sort of spin up and build it, they just appear. The downside is they tend not to disappear nearly as quickly, because you can spin them up, your IT guys can sit there and decide they want a new server today, and away we go. One's appeared 30 seconds later, which does give, from a privacy perspective, some additional concerns. Also, the speed and reliability of these is much greater than what you could ever offer in-house. There are some considerations around flexibility in terms of which jurisdictions, so which country you want to host in. The other thing, interestingly, is if you have configured the cloud if you have configured your application correctly, Usually the security of cloud services, with the exception of some of the software as a service services, is generally much higher than you can do in-house. They have much better tools to find out if they're being hacked, etc. at Microsoft than any of your organizations will ever be able to afford or should afford. So actually, with the right configuration, you can improve your security posture for it. However, there are some limitations to it. For example, you are in a shared infrastructure with other people. There are also some limitations at the moment about where you can host these things. We don't have a huge abundance of cloud providers in New Zealand just at the moment, and we'll talk more about that shortly. So let's think about what happens from a privacy perspective when we're considering using cloud services. So first of all, as we touched on, the cloud is not often in New Zealand. So where is the cloud? Where is your cloud is a really important question to ask. And what legislation is it governed by? Now, most of these cloud providers, with the exception of software as a service, you can specify where you want your cloud to be run from a number of options. So you can actually say, I only want my cloud to run in Australia. So you know that it is under Australian law and what protections that affords to you. By default on these clouds though, if you don't select the jurisdiction or location you want it to host from, it will do what's called float. So it will host from wherever in the world Microsoft or AWS have the lowest load at that time. Now, really common from New Zealand, that means it's quite often hosted in places like Singapore, which maybe don't have the same privacy requirements or considerations as we do in New Zealand, and may absolutely not be suitable for some New Zealand government departments. So one of the key things to ask your IT guys is, great, this is a cloud. Where is this cloud? You know, and have you locked it to that location? So some considerations, if your cloud is hosted in the US, this means that things like the Cloud Act apply. So that means that US law enforcement can force Microsoft, for example, to release personal information from your cloud under that act. Also, if you hosted in Europe, you are afforded the additional privacy controls that come with GDPR. So for New Zealanders, we often see people actually picking to host either in Australia, where the jurisdiction is similar, or to host in Europe. And that is because of the additional privacy regulations that country is governed by. Most people in New Zealand do avoid hosting in the US. The downside of hosting your stuff in Europe is sometimes the latency, so the speed that your service runs at. However, in modern days, that is becoming less and less of an issue as it goes through. In good news, though, we saw the announcement in Jacinda's press release recently in the last few days. Microsoft have announced they are going to come on shore in New Zealand. So within the next 12 months, hopefully, we will have the option of all the bells and whistles that Microsoft can offer us, but knowing that it's in New Zealand and in our jurisdiction, and we know what those laws are around it. That means, for example, the Encryption Act that is currently concerning some people, it was in the press around Parliament being able to move over to Office 365 in Australia because of the Encryption Act. That removes that consideration from it. So it may mean that some of those particularly sensitive agencies or organizations are able to make that move up to the Microsoft cloud. It can also change some of that cross-border flow protection that is coming in with the new bill that we talked about the other day. But it depends on how you consume the cloud as to whether that new cross-border flow protection is actually a problem. And we'll talk a bit more about that shortly. Other things about the cloud that can help. Some of the clouds covered by Privacy Shield. Now, if you're an organization that needs GDPR compliance, Privacy Shield is one of the mechanisms that allows you to migrate your data offshore from New Zealand to a third-party provider. And that is one of those safeguards that is a transfer mechanism under GDPR. Other things about the Privacy Shield, though, is that is not a long-term guarantee for for Europe that they are going to continue to accept that Privacy Shield. It's currently being contested in court, so it may mean that that's not going to happen. Also thinking about other jurisdictions. So, for example, in the UK, they have the UK Crime Act, which received royal assent in 2019. This means that they have authority from the UK to seek data held overseas for investigations and fraud offences. So if you're thinking, great, I'm going to hide all my data overseas and the New Zealand law will not be able to reach me, or the UK law, for example, you may need to rethink that decision. That has not removed your legal obligations in a lot of cases. So if we think about collection, we're going to take a step through the privacy life cycle here. For collection, depending on which of those cloud operating models you go for, you have more or less control. So for example, if you use the infrastructure as a service or the platform as a service, generally you as the consumer of that service are responsible for designing and building how you want to collect data into the cloud. That is not something the provider is going to give to you. So whatever design benefits or issues you had with your front end of your application, that is still going to exist. Moving to the cloud is not going to take that away from you. However, in contrast, if you use software as a service, you have very limited control. So you might be able to turn off some options. So for example, the software as a service application may say, would you like us to collect the email address from everyone who comes to sign up for your mailing list? You may be able to turn that on or off. However, you are constrained by what the provider has built. So as an example, one of my customers who is a software as a service provider was asked by one of their customers, can you please stop collecting the IP address for my customers? The answer for that is, in their case, no. It comes with the service. It's not an option you can turn off. Therefore, you as an organization are responsible for collecting that IP address because you are using that service and you signed up and asked them to collect all of that information on your behalf. So it is really important to understand, particularly in the software as a service space, what are they collecting and are you comfortable with it? Because at the end of the day, the Privacy Act still makes you responsible for that collection. They are collecting on your behalf. They are your agent and are collecting for you. Things like collection notices, though, have not gone away with using software as a service. So if you start and use software as a service facility, like some of the COVID contact tracing that you want all of your customers to sign up to when they come into your store or in your office, then you are still responsible for providing them a privacy notice. The better of the software as a service solutions give you an option to put your privacy notice in there. However, things like job advert sites, there is an option on those to add in your privacy notice. However, it usually has a standard one there. So if you don't change it, you might find that your privacy notice now has spaces for your name and or maybe in Latin if that's how it's been set up. So you need to make sure that you do put that privacy notice in. And also think about who is able to access that data and why, because that needs to be considered in that collection notice. So one of the key areas that often comes out of these software as a service that is inadvertent collection that you are unaware of is around cookies. So, for example, the provider of this software as a service may have built in a whole bunch of cookies to enable them to track how their service is performing, etc. Those are all things that you will need to disclose to those customers of yours if you're using it for a customer-facing application. Then thinking about how we use it. Now, if we have gone with one of the larger solutions, we will use it however we have usually use it if we have built it on site. So that will not change. So if you have infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, the use of your data is completely in your control and you decide on it. However, if you go for software as a service, you need to be very careful for some of those. So some of those, as part of signing up for that service, allow that service provider to use your data for statistical purposes or benchmarking. So, for example, there is a piece of software that allows us to develop business processes and plan them out and map them out. As part of that, in their T's and C's, they say that as using this software as a service product, they are allowed to use your data for benchmarking against other people, and they will be selling that data. That is something you need to consider as part of that. Now, often that data is not personal data because it is anonymized or aggregated. However, it is really often that it is commercially sensitive, and maybe you don't want them to do that. Also thinking about disclosure. So when we think about disclosure, we touched on this earlier. We have disclosure from the country that your cloud is in. So is there a disclosure that is going to occur due to legislation around the jurisdiction that your cloud is based in? But more often, disclosure issues for the cloud are by your own making. So it is really, really common that infrastructure as a service and platform as a service have breaches of the Privacy Act due to disclosure. The reason for that is the services that you spin up when you start up a service are generally built to be open to the internet. So by default, your bucket of data is available and open freely to everyone on the internet to access. Now, when you used to have your server room, your security guys would make sure that you had good walls around the edge, and although your data might freely flow within your organization, it couldn't get out of the building. With these cloud applications, that control has been removed from you. So it is really common every year to see multiple breaches where the headline is so-and-so's Amazon or Microsoft tenant or portal released all this personal information. And that is because the consumer, so the organization who set up that tenancy, didn't configure it correctly. Now, that is not the fault of the service provider. That is not the fault of the cloud. That is how your organization set it up. So it is really important that if you are moving to the cloud, things like penetration testing and those general security practices are not forgotten and don't get missed out. The other issue is, as it is now internet-based, everyone in the world has access to it. So if you did leave it open, that is everyone in the world who can come in and admire what you have left in the public arena. Also thinking about the provider. So you have a third party who stands this cloud up for you, whether it be Microsoft or whether it be Xero, depending on whether it's software as a service or infrastructure as a service potentially. Of those providers, a lot of them will say in their agreement that they have no rights to come into your tenancy. So they have no rights as the landlord to enter your flat in that shared building. However, others of them, particularly in the software as a service space, say that they have full unlimited rights to come into your flat whenever they feel like and just fumble around your data, etc. So you need to make sure that you have those contractual obligations in place to make sure that you are protected as you need from that disclosure. But also that goes one further. None of these cloud providers, with the exception potentially of Microsoft, can live in isolation. So they therefore subcontract stuff. So if we take Xero, for example, Xero will build their software. They have built it onto an infrastructure as a service platform. From memory, it's AWS. So there are two vendors in this mix where that risk may go down. So it's really important to understand the supply chain, particularly for that software as a service, to make sure that you are happy with the risks it brings with it. And as we spoke earlier about last week, in terms of the cross-border data protection, so that is the new changes coming in the New Zealand Privacy Act this coming year, hopefully. Those apply only if you are disclosing information to this cloud service provider. So if they are hosting it, if it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, then they are your agent. They are doing what you ask them to do. If it is software as a service, however, you need to be very careful whether they are acting as your agent or whether they are actually disclosing as well. So a lot of those software as a service products may be where your risk around the new changes under the Privacy Act may be coming into force. So those of you, a really common feature that is used by many people as software as a service, SurveyMonkey. So for example, SurveyMonkey, the free version, they have said they are using your data. They are generating additional surveys, etc. from it. It's in their T's and C's. Therefore, that would be a disclosure. They are using your data for other reasons other than what you asked them to do. Now, if on SurveyMonkey you pay for your license, that contractual clause goes away. Now, thinking through further, what happens when we don't want our cloud anymore? And I touched on this earlier. One of the challenges with the cloud is you can spin it up at a click of a button. So I can invent a new server in seconds in the cloud. The biggest issue we have, though, is when they created, they sit there indefinitely unless you either A, stop paying the bill, or B, turn them off. So therefore, whereas previously you would notice that you had old decrepit servers in your server room because you couldn't get any more things in there. In the new cloud version, you can have thousands of servers all holding personal data that you can't sync. So one of the key things is around visibility. So operational procedures, who's actually checking when we get the bill from these cloud service providers that we need it? You know, or can we actually turn things off on it? The other piece to it is what happens when we say we don't want it anymore. So when we turn off a cloud service provider in Microsoft, after 90 days, in accordance with their contract, they will delete your whole server, your whole tenant, and all your data will be gone. However, some of the SaaS providers, that is not always the case. They will only delete your data when you actually ask them to get rid of it, and that's part of their contract. So if you are using those services, you need to make sure when you finish with them, you actually ask them to get rid of your data, because that data is going to be sitting in the cloud somewhere in the world, and at the end of the day, you are still responsible for it. So if there is a privacy breach of that cloud, 12, 18 months after you've started using it, you are still the organization that is ultimately responsible for it. You are the one who's going to be doing the mandatory breach notification, and you are the one whose customer is going to be asking, why on earth was my data still there? So it is really important that particularly the hygiene processes for cloud are very well followed. But also part of that comes into the security of the cloud. So one of the biggest challenges of cloud products is often that they are available on the internet. So you log into them, particularly the software as a service, you log in. Now, if you use the integration, so if you combine their login with your Exchange, your login, so you use single sign-on, when you offboard someone from your organization, their account will stop working. So that's how Microsoft 365 works, etc., if you have integrated it. However, it is really common, particularly for the smaller agent organizations or the less mature, not to have integrated their Active Directory with the cloud one. Therefore, what they do is they issue another username and another password to every user of these services. Therefore, when someone leaves your organization, it's really common to find that they still have a login for your cloud service. So, for example, I looked at a customer recently where they had a breach. They had found that someone had been tweeting personal information on Twitter, which is a software as a service function, out to the internet, so out for everyone to see. And they were wondering why. What it transpired is they had offboarded this employee from their organization, but they had forgot to offboard them from their corporate instance of Twitter. Therefore, they had left them with full access rights to everything that was in their Twitter account and the ability to post for them. So it's really important, if you don't use single sign-on, that you are very, very robust in your onboarding and offboarding procedures. Otherwise, you will have left ex-employees with a large amount of access often to your personal data that's in the cloud. Now, the other problem is that when there is a breach, what happens? So when there is a breach of these cloud services, and it does happen, the service provider will generally notify you. Now, under New Zealand, you'll want to be sure you are notified, because you are going to have to notify the commissioner, etc., if it is a notifiable privacy breach. Now, how they notify you is often configured in the settings of your cloud service. Now, as we spoke about earlier, the ability to set these up is really, really simple. You hit next a number of times and voila, we have a new service. It is not always forefront in the mind of the IT person who set it up to think about whose name to write in the breach notification field. It is there on most of these services, but if you don't fill it in, then the provider of the services can't be expected to notify you. So one of two things often happens. Either it's blank and therefore you've got no notification, or the name in that breach field, if it was mandatory, is the name of the developer who set the server up somewhere never ago. And the problem is that when they get the breach notification 6, 12 months later, potentially, they're either not at your organization anymore, or they have no idea what to do with it. So they either ignore it or run around like a headless chicken. And we see both examples of that. So it's really important to go around and do a regular audit and make sure that that breach contact is actually someone who you want it to go to. So it might be your service desk, it might be your privacy officer, for example, but that breach is actually going to flow through to you correctly. So how do these things work? In terms of them, there are no hidden mystery of how they work. They work exactly as they used to. You write source code, so you write an application, it runs on a server, and it then goes out to the users of it. In terms of that, the server may be in the cloud, or it may be in your local data center, and then the application that you wrote on it may run from the cloud, or it may run from your local data center. Where this gets confusing, though, is you then may have other items interfacing with your cloud. So in the more modern age, we now have devices interfacing. So we have a lot of people whose cloud computing solution also integrates with all of their cell phones, with applications in the iTunes store, for example. So we need to think about how that happens, and where those information flows go is really important. So how does information flow to people's mobiles, to their PCs, for example, from the cloud? And we spoke earlier about having cloud visibility. So there are products around that allow you to see what is happening with your cloud. So they give you a dashboard, and you can see what servers you have running in your cloud, what solutions, and where they are running. So where in the world? Are they in France? Are they in Australia? They can also enable you those dashboards to see when your IT department or your vendor is making changes to those cloud services. So when your IT person goes in and goes, oh, I can't remember why we said that this wouldn't be open to everyone in the world to see, you will see that change happen in some of these dashboards. It also, a lot of the cloud providers allow you to audit their logs. So you can see who's been in your tenancy, what they have been doing, what they've been editing, etc. In the same way you used to be able to look at your logs on premise. However, you can also take those logs and put them into tools that maybe your IT department have for monitoring of these things. So they can see who is logging in, for example, or why is someone logging in. In terms of that, though, one thing to be careful of is the visibility for software as a service. So because, as we said earlier, you don't control the software, you don't control, therefore, things like releases to that software. That is not yours to manage. And some of the biggest privacy risks that come with software as a service come when we get new functionality. So the vendor releases a great new upgrade. If you're lucky, they have pre-warned you so you can assess the features and decide if you want to continue to use it or how you want to configure it. However, more of them, you just wake up one morning and discover it has new functionality. Now that leaves you scurrying to look at that functionality and maybe update your privacy impact assessment on that tool at very, very short notice. So many of these vendors have overcome this by allowing you to subscribe to things like mailing lists for that product so that you can know about upcoming changes and actually review them and talk with them about it before they get released to your environment that morning. So as we touched on earlier, for New Zealand, one of the key things is around data sovereignty. So we have a belief or a perception in New Zealand, in some cases, that our personal data is very sacred to us. And some of our iwi and our Māori groups have aspirations about what can and can't be held offshore. Now, we're saying these are aspirations, but they are cultural and they are cultural understandings. So part of this is a challenge for particularly New Zealand government about what data can be held offshore. So it's quite often or common to hear a discussion about a government department who can't move to the cloud because their data can't be held offshore due to considerations about Māori data sovereignty. However, as we said earlier, Microsoft have listened and understood about that barrier to uptake for the cloud for New Zealand and are therefore coming on shore. So a lot of that problem or challenge should have gone away with that change. Now, we talked earlier about security. So the key thing, as we said, is about considering who has access to it. As I say, it is always available. It is available anywhere in the world. So some key things that people do to protect their security for some of these services, they may restrict access to certain IP ranges. So that might be where your, so the IP range for your office. So for example, the only people who can get to that server are the people who are sitting in your office or on your office network working from home. Therefore, reducing down the access area of where people can hack you from, because it's now just your office. So that is one of the key things. If you can restrict down the IP addresses to only your location, that is absolutely something I would recommend. That also helps your offboarding problem. So if that's a bit slack, well, that's okay, because this ex-employee then also has to be in your office. In terms of that, thinking about some of those, though, just be careful, because if you restrict the access to it to only your office and you have built something that is meant to be customer facing on the internet, so a portal for customers to lodge a request for, I don't know, COVID wage subsidy, it is not going to work if you make it only available from your office. Also thinking about how we protect our data. So in terms of backups, a lot of these cloud services offer you the facility to do a backup or an archive. But it's often an optional extra you need to subscribe to. So they will often keep 30 days worth of stuff for you, but they won't keep it indefinitely. So if you actually need a backup for things like the Public Records Act, etc., then you actually have to arrange that. It doesn't just happen by some sort of strange magic. So if we think about some of our examples we have, so at the moment, one of the biggest things we are seeing is COVID-19 contact tracing apps. They are coming thick and fast every day onto the internet. Now, in terms of that, if you're going to roll those out, they're usually software as a service. So some of the things you'll be thinking about from a privacy perspective, how long is that provider built their service so that it keeps my data? Does it automatically delete after a month? Or is that a configuration setting I have to make? How am I going to give my users their privacy notice in that? Is there a spot for me to write it? Or am I going to have to stick a postie or something before they get to this application to actually give them that privacy notice? And then what is the vendor doing with that data? So if there's an incident, are they going to make it available to every DHB or the Ministry of Health? Or are they going to have to come through you as the provider to get that information? Are all really key considerations for that. Now, we talked earlier about the mapping for it. So it's really important to know where the data is going to be mapped, etc. In terms of it though, there are things that we need to think about as an organization. So first of all, in our privacy policy, what is our policy as an organization about going to the cloud? For example, some organizations' privacy policy will say it is okay to use infrastructure as a service or platform as a service as long as it is within our organization's tenancy that we already have and that you have discussed it with security. But they may also say software as a service is not allowed unless you have done a full privacy impact assessment. So those are things that might go in your policy. We then have your vendor contracts. And as I said, they're really important, particularly as a software as a service, that we go from there. In terms of privacy notices, we talked about this. How do you expect, how are you going to enable those privacy notices to occur? So from an operational perspective, what happens if we have a breach? But also, how do we assess the privacy of these services we're bringing on board? So for that, it is exactly the same as if we have built an application ourselves. There is a privacy impact assessment that may get done, or a threshold, and you would assess the risk in the same way. However, you may have additional risks that come out as part of being in a cloud. So that might be additional security, but it may also be those risks we talked about around disclosure or overseas data holdings where they are not your agent. So there are additional things to work through and additional challenges potentially with those cloud service providers. Now, what happens though if I am actually the person selling these SaaS services? So if I was Xero and I'm here selling my SaaS service provider, what do I need to think about? So for those people, they are not responsible for the data that you as an organization put in it. So the customers choose what data they want to put in the service. However, the vendors who make these services can help the customer uptake of these services. So for example, Xero is not responsible for deciding how long you're going to retain your data and deleting it, but they might offer a customer functionality to be able to set that, for example. So there might be options. Do you want to keep this data for 1 year, 3 years, 7 years, indefinitely? Quite often the default for SaaS providers is indefinitely, unless you say otherwise. Thinking about how do we let people put their privacy notices in, but also what do we tell those customers to aid them to write those privacy notices? So we need to be open and transparent about what data do we collect when you use this service so that they can actually get those privacy notices correct. Also thinking about what happens if somebody makes a Privacy Act request. So same thing happens as today. Person makes a Privacy Act request to an organisation. So to maybe Coca-Cola, who's a Xero customer. Coca-Cola get it, and they can either go into Xero, pull the data out themselves, or they may need the help from that service provider. So you may need a process that has been agreed between yourself and that service provider about how to get to that data in order to action a Privacy Act request for it. And then thinking about what contractual stuff do you put in place as a service provider? So it is quite common for software as a service. They are not going to agree to a bespoke contract with every single customer. It just doesn't work that way. So how can you ensure that you have got the most in that contract that gives the customers the biggest protection and understanding? So for New Zealand at the moment, if you were selling software in New Zealand as a service, you would be most probably looking to put in clauses that say, I am acting as your agent, or I am not disclosing your data, we are not using it for anything. Because that then gives the customer the confidence that you are not going to fall outside of that overseas disclosure. You might also put in provisions around jurisdiction. So we will only host your data in this country, for example, to give those people the confidence of what is happening. So in terms of how we can help, so one of the key things we do is privacy impact assessments. As we talked earlier about, is still as important as it is today for infrastructure held in-house that you do your privacy impact assessments and understand the risk around them. And the way you go about that is no different to how you would do it for something you built yourself in-house. The other thing, though, that comes into play is third-party risk assessments. So you are moving a lot of the risk over onto someone that is not in your direct control when you use the cloud. So this is about assessing how their service is architected and how their privacy practices work. So it's getting underneath the sales pitch to actually look and audit how the maybe software as a service or product is actually functioning, and looking at things like the history of breaches for that product, etc. So in summary, cloud computing is just a normal mode of operation for the vast majority of businesses. It is not something that should be shied away from. It is just something that brings a huge number of additional benefits, but some additional risks to it. And it is about understanding from a privacy perspective where that risk lies and how it works in.